What would you do if you knew someone was about to eat poisoned food? Now imagine you're a single mom working as a waitress, barely scraping by, and the only way to warn that person is to risk losing everything: your job, your daughter's health care, your entire livelihood. And here's the twist. The person you're trying to save isn't who they appear to be. He's dressed like a homeless man, but he's actually a billionaire in disguise, testing to see how his own restaurant treats people society has thrown away. That's exactly what happened one night at a five-star steakhouse. And the tiny note a waitress slipped into his hand changed everything. But what did that note say? And why did it lead to the complete destruction of everyone who thought they'd gotten away with something terrible? Before we dive in, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And hit that subscribe button because this story is absolutely wild. The clothes Frank Grant wore that evening were older than most of his employees. 35 years old, to be exact. A faded jacket with holes at the elbows. Pants stained with memories he'd never been able to wash away. He kept them in the back of his penthouse closet, hidden behind rows of tailored suits worth more than some people's annual salaries. Tonight, for the first time in decades, he put them on again. His assistant Diana stood by the door, watching him with barely concealed concern. She'd worked for him for 12 years, seen him make decisions that shook entire industries. But this was different. You could send someone else, she said, a professional inspector, someone trained for this. Frank looked at her through the mirror as he smeared dirt across his face. No one can see what I need to see. The anonymous letter had arrived a week ago, no return address. Just a short video clip in 3 sentences typed on plain paper. The video showed a man in ragged clothes being dragged out of a restaurant by security guards. While well-dressed customers laughed, the letter read, La Meridian, your restaurant. Your responsibility, or isn't it? La Meridian was the worst performing location in his entire chain. The quarterly reports blamed it on the neighborhood, the economy, changing demographics. But Frank had built his empire on one simple principle. Every person who walks through the door deserves to be treated with dignity. If that principle was being violated under his name, he needed to know. He removed his Patek Philippe watch, slipped off his wedding ring, placed them on the dresser. The only thing he kept was a small phone hidden in a compartment he'd carved into the sole of his shoe, capable of recording audio and making emergency calls. As he headed for the door, Diana made one last attempt. Frank, please, at least take security. He stopped and turned to face her. The scar on his right hand, the one he'd carried since he was 23, since a chef had poured boiling water on him for daring to search through a restaurant's garbage, seemed to burn under his skin. 35 years ago, no one protected me, he said quietly. And no one is protecting the people walking into that restaurant right now. That's why I have to go alone. Diana nodded reluctantly. I'll be parked across the street with the legal team. One signal from that phone and we're inside in 30 seconds. Frank allowed himself a small smile. That's why I keep you around. At 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening, La Meridian was alive with the sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths. The scent of seared beef and expensive wine hung in the air. The clientele was exactly what you'd expect: men in designer suits, women dripping with jewelry, all of them paying $200 a plate for the privilege of being seen in the right place. Sonia Williams had worked there for 3 years, long enough to know that the gleaming surface hid something rotten underneath. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, invisible in the way service workers were supposed to be. Her feet ached from standing since noon, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Her 7-year-old daughter Lily had another doctor's appointment next week, and the copay for her asthma medication had gone up again. Her younger brother's college tuition was due at the end of the month. She'd learned long ago to read people by their eyes. It was a survival skill from a childhood spent navigating spaces where she didn't belong. She could tell within seconds whether a customer would tip generously or stiff her, whether they saw her as a person or just part of the furniture. When the front door opened and a homeless man walked in, she saw immediately that something was wrong. Not with him. With everyone else, he was disheveled, yes. His clothes were torn and dirty, his beard unkempt, and he carried the unmistakable odor of someone who hadn't showered in days. But his posture was wrong. His shoulders were too straight, his stride too confident, and his eyes dark, watchful, taking in every detail of the room. Those were not the eyes of a man who'd been defeated by life. The hostess tried to block him at the entrance, her smile frozen in professional horror. The security guard moved. Closer, hand already reaching for his radio. And then Ricky Thornton appeared. Ricky had been the manager of Meridian for 5 years. He was the kind of man who wore his authority like a weapon, wielding it against anyone he deemed beneath him, which was almost everyone. He smiled at corporate executives and investors, but Sonia had seen the way he spoke to busboys and dishwashers when he thought no one was watching. "Sir," Ricky said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "I'm afraid you've made a mistake. This establishment may not be suitable for your situation." The homeless man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, more money than Sonia made in a month. "Table 7, he said calmly. "The Wagyu a 5, medium rare. I'll pay in advance." A ripple of shock went through the room. Ricky's smile flickered, caught between greed and disgust. He couldn't refuse paying customers. That was rule number 1 in the hospitality industry. But every instinct was screaming at him to throw this man out. "Of course," Ricky said through gritted teeth. "Right this way." He led the man to the worst table in the restaurant, tucked in a corner near the kitchen doors and the restroom hallway, where the noise was loudest and the smell occasionally drifted in from the garbage bins outside. It was the table they used. For customers they wanted to humiliate into leaving, the homeless man sat down without complaint. Ricky turned to scan the floor, his eyes landing on Sonia. "You," he said. "You're always talking about helping people in need. Here's your chance." It was meant as punishment, and they both knew it. Sonia walked to the table, water pitcher in hand, and poured a glass without meeting the man's eyes, but when she set it down, she felt him watching her. She looked up. His eyes caught hers, and in that moment something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. She couldn't name it, but it made her skin prickle with unease. This man was not who he appeared to be. In the kitchen, Ricky pulled the sous chef aside. Carlos Taylor was 28 years old and had been working at Le Meridian for 2 years. He was good at his job, talented enough to run his own kitchen someday. But he had a wife at home who was 7 months pregnant and a stack of medical bills that kept him chained to this place. Ricky led him to a corner where the security cameras couldn't reach. "The Wagyu for the homeless guy," Ricky said, peeping, his voice low. "Use the one that got sent back yesterday. The one that sat out for 2 hours before we put it back in the freezer." Carlos felt his stomach drop. "Ricky, that steak is compromised. If he eats it, what? He gets a stomach ache." Ricky laughed softly. "Who's going to believe a homeless man over a 5-star restaurant? He probably eats out of dumpsters anyway. Consider it a favor. This might be the best meal of his life. But if he gets seriously sick," Ricky's expression hardened. "Remember that $2,000 bottle of wine you dropped last month? The one I said I'd handle so it wouldn't come out of your paycheck?" He let the threat hang in the air. "Just, do what I tell you, Carlos. Unless you want to start explaining to your pregnant wife why you're unemployed." Carlos stood frozen, caught between his conscience and his fear. Finally, he nodded. Ricky patted him on the shoulder. "Good man." Neither of them noticed Sonia standing behind the spice rack, close enough to hear every word. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain someone would hear it. She pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. As Ricky walked past her and back out to the dining floor, Carlos turned and nearly collided with her. Their eyes met, and she saw the guilt written across his face. He knew she'd heard. He shook his head slowly, a silent warning. "Don't do anything. Don't say anything. Forget what you heard." Then he walked away, leaving Sonia alone with a choice. That could cost her everything. If she stayed silent, she'd keep her job. She'd pay for Lily's medicine and her brother's tuition. She'd survive. If she spoke up, no one would believe her. Ricky would destroy her reputation and fire her on the spot. She'd lose everything she'd spent years building, but if she did nothing, that man was going to eat poisoned food, and whatever happened to him would be on her hands. Sonia walked back to the dining floor on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Her hands trembled as she picked up a tray of empty glasses. The conversation she'd overheard played on repeat in her mind. Compromised meat. 2 hours. At room temperature. Who's going to believe a homeless man? She glanced toward table 7. The man sat there quietly, studying the menu as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't look like someone about to be poisoned. He looked like someone waiting for something. The cameras. Sonia's eyes flicked upward to the small black domes mounted in the corners of the ceiling. There were 6 of them covering the main dining area, plus 2 more near the entrance and 1 pointing at the bar. Ricky reviewed the footage every night, looking for any excuse to dock wages or write up employees. Last month he'd fired a busboy for taking a 5-minute break that wasn't authorized. The camera saw everything. If she approached the man and warned him out loud, Ricky would know within hours. She'd be fired before sunrise, blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. And then what? How would she pay for Lily's medication? How would she help her brother finish college? But if she stayed silent, that man could end up in the hospital. Or worse. There had to be a way. There had to be something she could do that. The cameras couldn't catch the staff bathroom. It was the only room in the building without surveillance. Ricky had complained about it once, saying he wanted to make sure employees weren't wasting time in there. But the owner had refused, citing privacy laws. That was where she could write something down. Something small enough to hide in her palm. Before she could move, Ricky appeared at her elbow. His presence was like a cold draft, making her stiffen involuntarily. "You've been standing here for 3 minutes, he said, his voice low and pleasant, the way it always was when he was about to say something cruel. "Is there a problem?" Sonia forced herself to meet his eyes. "No problem, just organizing the station." Ricky's gaze drifted toward table 7. "I noticed you looking at our special guest quite a lot, actually. I was just checking if he needed anything." "He doesn't need anything." Ricky leaned closer and Sonia could smell his cologne, something expensive that always made her slightly nauseous. "He's going to eat his meal, realize he doesn't belong here, and leave. That's the plan, understood?" Sonia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Good," Ricky smiled, but his eyes stayed flat and cold. "Don't do anything stupid, Sonia. You have a lot to lose." He walked away, stopping to chat with a table of regulars, his demeanor transforming instantly into warmth and charm. Sonia watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. He knew something was off. He was watching her now. She had to be careful, she had to be smart. And she had to move fast. The staff hallway was empty when Sonia slipped away. She walked quickly, keeping her head down, counting her steps until she reached the bathroom door. Inside, she locked herself in and leaned against the sink, taking deep breaths to steady her nerves. Her reflection stared back at her, a tired woman in a black uniform, hair pulled back in a tight bun, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like someone who'd been surviving for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to live, but she also looked like her mother. The memory came unbidden, sharp, and clear. Her mother on her deathbed, thin fingers wrapped around Sonia's hand, voice barely above a whisper. "Baby girl, there's going to come a time when doing the right thing means losing everything. But if you don't do it, you'll lose yourself. And that's worse. That's always worse." Sonia had been 24 then, already pregnant with Lily, already abandoned by the man who'd promised to stay. She'd thought she understood what her mother meant. Now, 8 years later, standing in a bathroom stall with a decision that could destroy her life, she finally did. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her order pad. Her hands shook as she tore off a small piece of paper, no bigger than a matchbook. She found a pen and wrote quickly, her handwriting cramped and uneven. "Don't eat. The meat is spoiled, intentional. They want to hurt you." She read it twice, then folded it until it was small enough to hide in the curve of her palm. The paper felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Now came the hard part. Carlos was plating the steak when Sonia walked back through the kitchen. She saw him hesitate as he placed the meat on the white porcelain dish, his jaw tight with something that might have been guilt. The steak looked perfect, seared to a deep brown, glistening with butter, accompanied by roasted vegetables and a drizzle of reduction sauce. No one looking at it would ever guess what it really was. Sonia stopped beside him, pretending to check. "On another order, Carlos," she said quietly. "You can't let this happen." He didn't look at her. "I don't know what you're talking about. That steak sat out for 2 hours. You know what that means? Food poisoning at minimum. If he has any underlying health conditions, stop." Carlos finally turned to face her, and she could see the fear in his eyes. The desperate calculation of a man trying to protect what little he had. "I have a baby coming in 2 months. My wife can't work right now. If I lose this job, and if that man dies, can you live with that?" Carlos's face contorted with anguish. "What do you want me to do, Sonia? Go out there and tell everyone Ricky ordered me to serve bad meat? Who's going to believe me? Ricky will deny everything, fire me for lying, and make sure I never work in this industry again." Sonia wanted to argue, wanted to shake him until he saw reason, but looking into his eyes, she understood. He wasn't a bad person, he was a trapped person, just like her. Just like everyone who worked in places like this, where the people at the top held all the power and the people at the bottom held all the risk. "Fine," she said softly. "You didn't see anything. You don't know anything." Relief flooded Carlos's face, followed immediately by shame. He opened his mouth to say something, an apology maybe, or justification. But Sonia had already turned away. She would do this alone. The plate was ready. Sonia picked it up from the pass, balancing it on her palm with practiced ease. The steak was still sizzling slightly, sending up wisps of fragrant steam. To anyone watching, it would look like she was simply doing her job, bringing a meal to a customer. She walked through the dining room, weaving between tables, her eyes fixed on the corner where the homeless man sat. Her free hand hung at her side, the folded paper pressed between her fingers, hidden from view. 10 feet away. 5 feet. 2 feet. She stopped at the edge of the table and set the plate down gently, positioning the steak in front of him with a server's precision. "Your Wagyu of 5, sir," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Medium rare, as requested." The man looked up at her, and again she felt that strange spark of recognition. His eyes were dark and intelligent, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She had the sudden irrational thought that he could see right through her, that he already knew everything she was about to tell him. She placed the silverware beside the plate, and as she did, her hand brushed against his. In that brief moment of contact, she pressed the folded paper into his palm, feeling his fingers close around it instinctively. "Enjoy your meal," she said, holding his gaze for just a second longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked away, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire restaurant could hear it. Frank watched the waitress retreat, his hand closed around the small piece of paper she'd given him. Her face had been carefully neutral, but her eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, had been screaming a warning. He waited until she was across the room, then casually dropped his hand below the table and unfolded the note. "Don't eat. The meat is spoiled, intentional. They want to hurt you." He read the words 3 times, letting them sink in. Then he looked down at the beautiful steak sitting in front of him. The meal that was supposed to make him sick, to punish him for daring to exist in a space where people like him weren't welcome. Something cold and hard settled in his chest. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something older, something he'd buried deep inside himself 35 years ago and thought he'd forgotten. He remembered being 23, hungry and desperate, digging through a restaurant's garbage for scraps of food. He remembered the chef who'd caught him, the pot of boiling water that had been thrown at his hands, the searing pain that had made him scream. He remembered the laughter of the kitchen staff, the way they'd called him names, told him he was worthless, that he deserved to suffer for being poor. The scar on his right hand throbbed with phantom pain. he'd built his empire to prove them wrong. Every restaurant he owned was supposed to be different, a place where dignity wasn't reserved for the wealthy, where every person who walked through the door was treated with respect. That was the whole point. That was the only thing that had ever mattered. And now, in one of his own restaurants, they were trying to poison a man they thought was homeless. Frank set down the knife and fork he'd been holding. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't leave. He would sit here and watch. And when the time was right, he would burn this whole rotten system to the ground. 20 minutes passed. The steak sat untouched, growing cold on its plate. Frank remained in his seat, occasionally sipping water, his eyes moving slowly around the room. From behind the bar, Ricky watched with growing unease. The homeless man should have eaten by now. He should have been halfway through the meal, already starting to feel the effects of the bacteria multiplying in his gut. Instead, he just sat there, calm and still, like he was waiting for something. Ricky smoothed down his tie and walked over to table 7, his customer service smile firmly in place. "Is everything all right with your meal, sir?" he asked, letting a note of concern creep into his voice. "You haven't touched it." The homeless man looked up at him. There was something in his expression that Ricky couldn't quite read. Something that made him feel like he was the one being evaluated rather than the other way around. "The atmosphere," the man said. "I'm enjoying it." Ricky's smile flickered. "I see. Well, if there's anything wrong with the food, I'd be happy to have the kitchen prepare something else." "The food looks perfect." The man's eyes held Ricky's without blinking. "I'm just savoring the moment." Something was wrong. Ricky could feel it in his bones. That prickling sensation at the back of his neck that had saved him from trouble more times than he could count. This man was not behaving the way a homeless person should behave. He was too confident, too calm, too controlled. Ricky glanced across the room to where Sonia was refilling water glasses at another table. She had served him. She'd been alone with him for a few seconds. Had she said something? Done something? He'd deal with her later. Right now, he needed to handle the situation in front of him. "Well," Ricky said, keeping his voice pleasant, "please let me know if you need anything at all." He walked away, but his mind was racing. The longer that man sat there without eating, the more dangerous this became. If he complained to corporate, if he called the health department, if he made any kind of scene, Ricky needed to get him out of the restaurant. Now, the confrontation came 30 minutes later. A woman at a nearby table draped in diamonds and designer clothes waved Ricky over with an imperious gesture. Her husband sat beside her, looking embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. "This is unacceptable," the woman hissed, barely keeping her voice down. "We're paying $400 for dinner, and we have to sit near ... She gestured toward Frank with unconcealed disgust. "The smell alone is ruining my appetite." Ricky nodded sympathetically. "I completely understand, ma'am. Let me handle this." He walked back to table 7, his stride more purposeful now, his smile replaced by a businesslike expression. "Sir," he said, "I'm afraid I need to ask you to leave. We have other guests who require this table." Frank looked up at him calmly. "I've paid for my meal. I'll refund your money in full. I don't want a refund. I want to sit here." Ricky felt his patience fraying. Around them, other diners were starting to notice the exchange, conversations dying down as heads turned in their direction. "Sir, I must insist." "On what grounds?" Frank's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "I've paid for my food. I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm simply sitting here in a seat I've paid for, in a restaurant that's open to the public. What law am I breaking?" Ricky opened his mouth and closed it again. The man was right. Technically, he couldn't forcibly remove a paying customer without cause, not with this many witnesses around. If this turned into a scene, if someone recorded it on their phone, the publicity nightmare would be enormous. He needed another approach. His eyes found Sonia again, and suddenly the solution became clear. If he couldn't blame the customer, he'd blame the staff. He'd turn this into a disciplinary issue, remove the inconvenient witness, and deal with the homeless man quietly after the crowd thinned out. Ricky straightened his jacket and raised his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Sonia Williams, please come here." Sonia looked up from across the room, her face carefully blank. She set down the water pitcher she was holding and walked over, each step slow and deliberate. "Yes?" Ricky turned to face her, making sure his expression conveyed righteous disappointment. "I've received complaints that you were inappropriate with this guest, that you made comments that were unprofessional and offensive." Sonia's eyes widened. "That's not true." "I didn't say anything." "Multiple witnesses," Ricky continued talking, "over her have reported that you deliberately tried to embarrass this gentleman. In light of this, I have no choice but to suspend you immediately, pending a full investigation." The dining room had gone silent. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation unfolding at table 7. Sonia stood frozen, her mouth open in disbelief. Unable to form words, across the room, Carlos watched from the kitchen doorway, his face pale with guilt. He knew the truth. He knew Sonia had done nothing wrong, that Ricky was lying to cover his own crimes. But he couldn't speak. His wife. His baby, his future. Everything depended on his silence. He lowered his eyes and stepped back into the kitchen. Sonia was alone, the moment stretched into eternity. Sonia stood in the middle of the restaurant, surrounded by strangers who were watching her humiliation like it was dinner theater. Ricky's words echoed in her ears: suspended, investigation, inappropriate, each one a nail in the coffin of her career. She thought about Lily at home with the babysitter, probably already asleep. She thought about the stack of medical bills on her kitchen counter, the tuition payment due next week, the carefully constructed life that was crumbling around her. She'd done the right thing. She'd risked everything to warn a stranger. And now she was being punished for it while the real criminal stood in front of her, with a self-righteous smile on his face. Tears burned at the backs of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Ricky that satisfaction. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I served him his food. That's all I did." Ricky shook his head sadly. "The witnesses say otherwise. Please collect your things and leave the premises. We'll be in touch about next steps." Sonia looked around the room, searching for anyone who might stand up for her. The other servers avoided her gaze. The customers watched with mild interest, already composing the story they'd tell their friends tomorrow. No one moved. No one spoke. She was invisible. She'd always been invisible. And then, from the corner table, a voice cut through the silence. She didn't say anything inappropriate. Everyone turned to look at the homeless man who was rising slowly from his seat. "She brought me my food," he continued, his voice calm and clear. "She was polite and professional, that's all." Ricky's expression hardened. "Sir, this is an internal matter." "No." The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "This is a public accusation made in front of dozens of witnesses. If you're going to fire this woman, you should at least have the decency to do it honestly." Something in his tone made Ricky take a step backward. The homeless man's posture had changed, his shoulders squaring, his chin lifting. He no longer looked like someone society had discarded. He looked like someone who was used to being obeyed. "Who are you?" Ricky demanded. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think it's time you found out." Frank reached down and removed his shoe. The diners closest to him recoiled, expecting the worst. But instead of the smell they anticipated, they watched in confusion as he pulled a small phone from a hidden compartment in the sole. He pressed a button, and within 30 seconds, the front door of La Meridian swung open. Diana walked in first, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her expression cold and professional. Behind her came 2 men in dark blazers, lawyers, judging by the briefcases they carried, and 4 members of a private security team. They'd been waiting in the black SUV parked across the street, monitoring the situation through the open line. On Frank's phone, the restaurant fell into stunned silence. Diana crossed the room and stopped beside Frank, her posture radiating authority. She turned to address the crowd, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Allow me to introduce Frank Grant, founder and owner of the entire La Meridian restaurant chain. A gasp rippled through the dining room. The wealthy woman who complained earlier turned pale, her hand flying to her mouth. Her husband stared at Frank with dawning horror. Already calculating the social damage of what they'd done, Ricky stood frozen, his face draining of color. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. Frank stepped forward, and even in his ragged clothes, even with dirt still smeared across his face, he carried himself with the unmistakable presence of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. "I've been recording everything tonight," he said, holding up the phone. "Every word, every interaction, including a very interesting conversation that took place in your kitchen about 45 minutes ago." Ricky's eyes widened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Really?" Frank gestured toward the untouched plate on table 7. "Then perhaps you can explain what's wrong with this steak. The one you ordered your sous chef to prepare using meat that had been sitting at room temperature for 2 hours before being refrozen." The crowd erupted in murmurs of disgust and disbelief. Several diners pushed their own plates away, suddenly suspicious of everything they'd been served. Ricky shook his head frantically. "That's a lie. I never said anything like that. This is slander." Frank turned toward the kitchen doorway where Carlos stood frozen, his face ashen. "Carlos Taylor," Frank called out. "You have a choice right now. You can tell the truth about what happened tonight, or I can play the recording and let everyone hear your voice agreeing to serve contaminated food to a customer." Carlos didn't move. His eyes darted between Frank and Ricky, trapped between two impossible options. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Think about your wife," Frank continued, his voice softening slightly. "Think about your baby. Do you want to be the man who stood by and let this happen? Or do you want to be the man who finally did the right thing?" The second stretched into eternity. Carlos looked at Sonia, who stood alone in the middle of the room, her career in ruins, her reputation destroyed, all because she'd chosen to warn a stranger instead of protecting herself. She'd been braver than him. She'd risked everything while he'd hidden in the kitchen, too afraid to speak. Carlos stepped forward, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Ricky ordered me to use the steak that was sent back yesterday. It had been left out for almost 2 hours before we put it back in the freezer. He said no one would believe a homeless man if he got sick. He said it would teach him a lesson for coming here." The dining room exploded. Customers shouted in outrage, some already reaching for their phones to call lawyers or journalists. The security team moved to block the exits, ensuring no one left. Before the situation was resolved, Ricky backed away, his hands raised defensively. "He's lying. This is a conspiracy. I've worked here for 5 years. I would never—" "The recording doesn't lie," Frank interrupted. "And neither do the financial records my team has been reviewing for the past week. Embezzlement, falsified inventory reports, systematic theft from this restaurant for years. Did you really think no one would notice?" Ricky's facade finally crumbled. The charming, confident manager disappeared, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He turned and tried to run, but the security team was faster. 2 of them caught him before he reached the door, restraining him as he struggled and cursed. "You can't do this to me," Ricky screamed. "I'll sue you. I'll destroy you." Frank walked toward him slowly, stopping just a few feet away. 35 years ago," he said quietly, "a man poured boiling water on my hands because I was hungry and desperate. He laughed while I screamed. He told me I was worthless, that I deserved to suffer for being poor." He held up his right hand, showing the faded scar that crossed his skin. "I built this company so that no one would ever be treated that way in a place that belonged to me. And you turned it into exactly the kind of place I swore to destroy." Ricky stared at him, all the fight draining from his body. "The police are on their way," Diana announced. "Mr. Thornton will be facing charges for attempted poisoning, embezzlement, and fraud." As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. An hour later, the restaurant had emptied. The police had taken Ricky away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen. The other diners had been sent home with refunds and apologies. The staff had been dismissed for the night, told that representatives from corporate would be in touch about the future. Only Frank and Sonia remained. She sat at a table near the window, staring at her hands. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She'd done the right thing. She'd saved a man's life. And yet she felt hollow, uncertain of what came next. Frank approached and sat down across from her. He'd washed the dirt from his face, though he still wore the same ragged clothes. Up close, without the disguise of grime and desperation, she could see him clearly for the first time. The sharp intelligence in his eyes, the quiet strength in his bearing. "You knew," he said. "When you wrote that note, you knew it could cost you everything, your job, your daughter's health care, your brother's education. Why did you do it?" Sonia looked up at him. "Because 35 years ago, someone didn't help you when you needed it. And you've been carrying that scar ever since." Frank's expression shifted, surprise breaking through his composure. "How did you know?" "I saw it in your eyes," she said simply. "When I brought you the water, I looked at you and I knew those weren't the eyes of a homeless man. Those were the eyes of someone who used to be homeless, someone who remembered what it felt like." Frank was silent for a long moment, studying her face. "You read people," he said finally. "That's a rare gift." "It's not a gift, it's survival." Sonia's voice was steady, but there was a weight behind her words. "When you grow up the way I did, you learn to see what people are really thinking. It's the only way to stay safe." Frank nodded slowly. He understood that kind of survival better than most. "What happens now?" Sonia asked. "The restaurant will close for renovations, new management, new staff training, new everything." He leaned forward slightly. "And I need someone to lead it. Someone who understands what this place should be. Someone who has the courage to do the right thing even when it costs them." Sonia stared at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a choice," Frank corrected. "This isn't charity and it isn't a reward. It's an opportunity. You can take it or leave it." 1 week later, Sonia's phone rang. She was sitting in her small apartment, Lily asleep in the next room. The familiar stack of bills spread across the kitchen table. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Williams, this is Diana, Mr. Grant's assistant. He asked me to extend a formal offer for the position of general manager at Meridian, effective upon reopening." Sonia closed her eyes. She'd been thinking about this moment ever since that night, turning it over in her mind, trying to decide what she wanted. "The salary is competitive," Diana continued. "Full benefits, including comprehensive health care for your family. Mr. Grant wanted me to emphasize that this is your decision. No pressure, no expectations." Sonia thought about her mother's words spoken so many years ago, about doing the right thing even when it meant losing everything, about losing yourself if you didn't. She'd done the right thing. And instead of losing everything, she'd been given a chance at something new. "I'll take it," she said. "But I have one condition." 3 months later, Le Meridian reopened. The space had been transformed. Same elegant bones, but warmer now. More welcoming, the lighting was softer, the music gentler. The staff trained in a philosophy that Sonia had helped develop. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look or how much money they have. Sonia stood near the entrance in a tailored black suit, greeting guests as they arrived. She looked different than she had 3 months ago. Not just the clothes, but the way she carried herself. Her shoulders were straight, her chin lifted, her eyes clear and confident. The door opened, and a man walked in. His clothes were worn and dirty, his hair unkempt, his shoes held together with tape. He looked around nervously, clearly expecting to be thrown out. The hostess hesitated, glancing toward Sonia. Sonia walked forward before anyone else could react. "Welcome to La Meridian," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Would you like a table by the window?" The man stared at her in disbelief, waiting for the catch, the cruel joke, but there was none. "I don't have much money," he admitted quietly. Sonia smiled. "That's all right. We have a community menu for guests who need it. Please come in." She led him to a table near the window, the best seat in the house. As she walked back to her post, she passed a new addition to the restaurant's decor, a small frame mounted on the wall near the entrance. Inside the frame was a piece of paper, creased and worn, with cramped handwriting that read, "Don't eat, the meat is spoiled. Intentional, they want to hurt you." Beneath it, a small plaque bore an inscription, "One small act of courage can change everything." This note saved a life and brought down a corrupt system. It hangs here to remind us, dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. Sonia Williams, general manager, that had been her condition. And every day when new employees started their training, they stood before that frame and learned the story of the night everything changed. The night a billionaire dressed as a homeless man walked into a restaurant and a waitress with nothing to lose risked everything to save him, because sometimes the people with the least power are the ones who change the world. Look, here's what I want you to take away from this story. Sonia had every reason to stay silent. She was a single mom barely making ends meet, one paycheck away from disaster. Warning that stranger could have and almost did cost her everything, but she did it anyway. Not because she expected a reward, not because she thought it would work out for her in the end, but because she couldn't live with herself if she didn't. That's real courage. Not the absence of fear, but doing the right thing even when you're terrified of what it'll cost you. And here's the other lesson. Frank could have destroyed Ricky from a distance. One phone call, one corporate order, and it would have been over. But he put on those old clothes and walked into that restaurant because he needed to see the truth with his own eyes. He needed to know if the values he built his empire on were actually being practiced or just printed on a mission statement somewhere. You can't change what you won't face. And sometimes the people at the top need to remember what it feels like to be at the bottom. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment. Have you ever had to choose between doing the right thing and protecting yourself? What did you choose? I want to hear your stories. Thanks for being here. Until next time, remember, the smallest act of courage can change everything. Take care of yourselves.